The rain tapped a slow chord against the glass of the downtown cleaning supply closet, a soft percussion that smelled faintly of bleach and lemon oil. The fluorescent light hummed in a way that made the air seem thin and honest. Nora Bishop straightened the cardboard box of archive folders on top of a stack of mops, and for a moment looked like any other person caught in a pause between tasks, but the crease of her suit and the way she smoothed her hand over the papers told a different story. She had run companies, brokered deals, survived boardrooms that used the word execute as a verb meant to humble. 30 years had taught her how to trust numbers and contracts more than people. Tonight, she had exploded out of a shareholders' reception without finishing a speech, needing only the darkness of the service corridor to remind her she was not required to play hostess to praise she did not want. The corridor smelled of wet concrete and the faint, stubborn sweetness of a vending machine coffee that no one had the time to drink. When someone knocked over a bucket, leaving a slick on the linoleum, a man in work boots and a faded janitor jacket swore under his breath and reached for a mop. He moved with the ease of muscle memory and care, and the mop head wept water in arcs that caught the fluorescent light. He looked up at her with a face lined by small defeats and bright persistence, the way a coin bears the imprint of many hands. His name tag read Leo Martin. He said, "Are you okay, ma'am?" in a voice edged by the warm grain of spent patience. She laughed in a way that surprised her, a small inhalation that let out the ballast she had been carrying. He smiled in a way that seemed to say he had no right to think much at all about people like her, and yet had learned to listen anyway. They stood in the doorway between her empire of polished marble and his world of scuffed tiles and dripping sinks, and for a breath the rain outside was not sound but permission. Was this a small collision or the first fracture of something larger, she wondered silently, feeling the old palpitation her heart had not allowed in 30 years. Nora left in a plainness she had not practiced in a long while. In the suite above, glass walls reflected faces that belonged in magazines and in the papers she signed. The board meeting earlier had been efficient and cold, a liturgy of quarterly numbers that left little room for soft mistakes. She returned to her penthouse by routine more than affection. Routine was a thing she could manage. Routine kept people from moving into one another and making messes. She had a ritual of tea brewed at exactly 9 and a stack of unread design magazines. She had learned early that solitude could be arranged like furniture, each container for thought locked and labeled. Yet that evening, a sap of something uncharted had been opened by a mop and a steady gaze. At the heart of Nora was a memory she rarely allowed herself to name. As a child, she had been one of many mouths at a long dinner table, always the first to help clear plates to earn small praise, a small economy of attention that taught her value came with doing more. She had climbed out of that life with scholarships and a stubborn set of promises to herself. And those promises hardened into a career that measured value in growth charts. There had been losses, a marriage that taught her negotiation does not equal intimacy, the dying of a father who used to whistle while he fixed leaky faucets. The grief of those days had carved her into a woman who could command a room and hide flinches. Those stories moved through her now like small ghosts when she watched Leo float mops across a lobby. Leo rose before dawn and returned home to a narrow apartment above a laundromat that smelled of detergents rubbed thin. He had a daughter named Sophia, 7, with laugh lines in her small mouth and a habit of drawing suns in every margin. His life had been a long thread of work shifts stitched into evenings of homework help and microwave dinners. He kept a small toolbox in the back of his closet and a library of bedtime stories he recited in voices that would make Sophia giggle. He had once trained to be a mechanic, and then a setback shifted him into custodial work, where the dignity was not always visible, but the pay arrived like steady rain. He had been a single parent for the last 5 years, after his ex had left with promises she could not keep, and a fear of bills. Raising Sophia had been both a calculation and an overflow of tenderness. Part of Leo was made of the practical wisdom of someone who understood the cost of every choice, and who measured generosity by what it did to other people, not by grand pronouncements. He had grown up in a neighborhood that taught you to say your name with pride, even when your shoes were falling apart. He feared failure because he saw its hollow on the faces of others who had not been saved by luck. Yet he also carried a stubborn softness. He believed children deserved bedtime songs and that paper drawings should be kept forever because they were the only records some small lives leave. This memory of craft and care sat like a warm stone in his chest when he dealt with the building that belonged to others but that he made livable. Their second meeting came days later, over an incident nobody thought would matter until it did. Nora had returned to the lobby to retrieve a tablet she had left. Charging behind the concierge desk, the elevator smelled of burnt toast, the airlock between floors heavy with the breath of the building. Sophia had been in Nora's lobby because Leo, who worked nights, took his shifts between schools and shifts at an after-school program where he volunteered 3 evenings a week. He arrived with a small damp backpack where a crayon sun wobbled on a folded sheet. When Sophia saw Nora, she announced in the loud earnestness of children that she knew people who run buildings and people who clean them, and both were important. The line broke the kind of social code that existed around the glass and the marble. Dialogue developed then, careful and long. Nora asked Sophia about school, and Sophia jabbered about spelling tests and a lunchbox with a dinosaur sticker. Leo apologized for the intrusion and took a small breath that belonged to all men who must explain their children at work. Nora said, "You do an excellent job keeping this place clean," and Leo responded with a crooked smile that said, "Thank you," but what he meant was something like, "I did what I had to do." The exchange grew into an invitation for coffee that Nora almost rescinded because invites were not her currency. But something in the way Sophia tugged at Leo's jacket and asked if he could show Nora the drawing of their cat, and the fact that Nora paused and looked at the drawing, and the kind of slow recognition that passes when someone shows you a part of themselves, made her say yes. The coffee was small, the chairs close, the sounds of cups and spoons a domestic percussion unusual in the corporate orbit she inhabited. They talked about ordinary things and found in them a syntax neither of them had thought could be shared. Nora kept noticing the calluses on Leo's hands and the way he thumbed a thread loose on his sleeve before explaining a small fix he had planned for a squeaky stair. He, in turn, listened to stories Nora told about trying to launch a scholarship fund and the friction of writing checks that never seemed to reach the people who needed them. There was a quality to the conversation that refused to be catalogued as charity or patronage. It was a fragile equality where they both gave measurable things and both received something that could not be itemized. They began to see each other in half measures. Nora liked to volunteer at a literacy night held in the municipal library, where Leo sometimes helped with setting up chairs. He brought Sophia and a thermos of lukewarm coffee, and Nora brought a stack of donated books with neat labels. The meetings were punctuated by small sensory details that stitched them together. There was the smell of new paperbacks that Nora loved, the hot edge of a city bus in summer when Leo joined her and their conversation spilled into traffic, the roughness of a park bench where Sophia would insist on Irish jigs before reading time. Each scene was heavy with at least 4 kinds of senses: the taste of a cheap candy bar shared, the sticky press of fruit on Sophia's hands, the friction of Nora's shoes on gravel, the almost inaudible hum of an overhead transformer. Their dialogue lengthened. In a long exchange over a pot of cheap diner coffee, Leo asked why Nora seemed to carry the whole world on her shoulders, and she confessed a fear that if she stopped managing everything, she would lose what she had fought for. He told her his fear was simpler and worse at times, that he might not be enough for Sophia in ways that mattered when school fees rose or when the winter heater broke and fixed incomes did not. They traded stories in 8 to 10 long turns each scene, pausing to measure the subtext as if the space between words was where truth lived. Their words were often a way of checking for the humanity in each other rather than asserting status. Rumors, like leaves, found places to collect where wind made small paths. A photograph taken by an intern of Nora walking with Leo outside the Civic Center appeared on a gossip feed with a headline that assumed scandal and appetite. It spread because scandals are like mechanical processes designed to apportion shame. People at the office sent messages that called the photograph inappropriate and asked for guidance from HR. Jenna Park, in Human Resources, forwarded the memo to Marcus Reed, the corporate counsel, with a terse note and suggested a quiet inquiry. Robert Ames, the board chair, left a voicemail for Nora that had the tone of someone who prefers consequences be decided by committees rather than hearts. At the same time, a neighbor in the building, Rosa Delgado, called the concierge to ask if the cleaning staff had a key to the gardens and mentioned that she had seen Nora around, which set up a neighborly curiosity that fed the feed. The rumor became a protocol. The company had a reputation to preserve. There were meetings and soft threats and an op-ed that opined about optics. Those in Nora's orbit who loved her from a safe distance whispered about impropriety and the risk of humbling a career built on unassailable competence with a romance that made her look soft. Nora received an anonymous note at her desk with the single word "caution" written in stiff black ink. Leo heard about the rumors through a text from his sister Carmen, who lived 2 blocks over, and who encouraged him to be careful. The community around them reacted in many small ways that were instructive about power. Some were sympathetic, like Tony at the after-school program who offered to testify to Leo's character if the need arose. Others were pragmatic, like Malik, the building superintendent, who called to make sure Leo did not face retaliation and who offered
access to a union rep if necessary. The pressure escalated because institutions are designed to act when noise becomes signal. The board issued an inquiry into potential conflicts of interest. HR opened an informal file to determine whether Nora had used corporate resources in ways that might be construed as favoritism. Marcus Reed drafted a memo about a code of conduct, which he labeled corporate integrity, and distributed it with the sterile warmth of an automatic response. The memo cited contractual obligations and potential reputational harm. In a concise technical paragraph that read like a procedure manual, an investigator described chain of custody for digital assets, how access logs to building systems would be subpoenaed, and how interviews would be scheduled with all parties to determine whether there had been an abuse of position. The legalese included reference to non-disclosure provisions and potential clawback clauses in executive compensation. It was the kind of language that can make everyday affection sound like a policy breach. Leo felt the cold of being seen not for what he gave, but for what he might take. Nora felt as if she had been reframed as an item on a balance sheet and not a human who could err toward kindness. They tried to defend themselves with words that were at once personal and procedural. In a scene that became a long, careful negotiation, Nora met with Jenna from HR and Marcus from legal. The office smelled like polish and the coffee was too black. Jenna, patient and precise, asked Nora if she had disclosed her association with building staff as required. Nora answered in a stretch of sentences that walked through how she had not considered a coffee with a janitor to be an association of corporate interest, and how such a distinction exposed a blind spot she had about privilege. Marcus asked about gifts, about invitations, about dinners. They discussed protocol in 8 to 10 exchanges that revealed more than policy. In the room next door, Leo brought Sophia to see a show at a community theater, and they sat with buttered popcorn and whispered about nothing and everything. Their scenes were punctuated by sensory detail, the velvet of the theater seat, the light of the stage on Sophia's hair, the small warmth of shared cotton candy. The story gained momentum as the corporate file thickened, and the local paper requested comments that Nora declined to give. Then someone accused Leo of taking company time to perform private errands for Nora. An internal audit turned up slipping entries on his timesheet that matched the night of an event where he had been seen helping with heavy crates for a corporate charity. Leo insisted he had been paid for hours and that his shifts were recorded. The audit team, led by a precise woman named Priya Shah, compiled surveillance footage and timestamps and constructed a narrative that looked damning until context was applied. The nuance of caring collapsed under the authority of checked boxes. There was a petition from a small faction of shareholders asking the board to consider the optics.
At the same time, a parenting organization filed an amicus brief to highlight the risks families face when one parent works in a precarious job and the other in positions of power. The conflict that began as private affection expanded into a public argument about class and obligation. The turning point came when Nora received a message from an unexpected quarter. Sophia, who had handed Nora a drawing of a house with a crooked chimney and 2 stick figures inside, left a note attached that read, "Thank you for the story time." An image of the drawing circulated with the publication of a report on the inquiry, and it became a symbol for some and a scandal for others. An old friend of Nora's from university named Daniel Klein, who had become a journalist known for stories about inequality, reached out and suggested a piece that would reframe the narrative from salacious rumor to structural imbalance. The board grew restless, but the public conversation shifted from personal gossip to questions about power. In a scene that unfolded in the courtroom of public opinion, Nora agreed to speak with Daniel. He asked detailed questions about her motives and her memories about why she had left the speech that night. She spoke in long, measured turns about the weight of loneliness and the smallness of kindness that can make people vulnerable when institutions are rigid. Her words, filmed in a small studio with an honest light, were precise and fragile and human. When legal action became unavoidable, they did not expect it would center on custody. But a complaint was filed by Nora's estranged sister in a maneuver that read like a gambit to force Nora back into family negotiations about inheritance and reputation. The case that followed bifurcated into 2 streams, the corporate investigation and a family dispute that introduced questions about Nora's capacity to make decisions unencumbered by personal relationships. The courtroom scene was described in clinical terms during preparation. An outline explained how evidence would be admitted, how hearsay would be handled, and how witness credibility could be challenged by showing potential bias. Counsel for the board planned to question whether Nora had allowed personal attachments to affect corporate judgments. Leo feared that protests against him might lead officials to consider him a flight risk in custody decisions because of his precarious job. The technical description of the court process included motion practice, the filing of declarations, the use of expert testimony about corporate governance, and a schedule for depositions. It read like a sequence of steps that could make the messy reality of 2 people feel like a case study. The public hearing happened on a humid day, where the courtyard outside the courthouse smelled of hot tar and pretzel carts. The courtroom itself was at once solemn and mundane. A fan rattled softly in the corner while a bailiff stamped papers. Witnesses were sworn in and seated. The exchange between Nora and the board legal counsel was long and formal. Nora sat with her hands folded and answered questions that often required her to choose words that would be translated into precedent. Leo watched from the gallery. He had asked Tony and Carmen to come, and his sister sat with a knitted scarf and eyes that did not look at him but at the proceedings. Sophia had been allowed a day at her grandfather's, which they had arranged with care. Nora's testimony was deliberate. She described the moment at the supplier's reception where the mop and the rain intersected like a small mercy. The counsel for the board asked about whether she had used company resources. Witnesses were called one by one. Jenna described the standard, Robert Ames explained the board perspective, and Malik spoke to the routine of maintenance scheduling. The prosecutor-like figure asked questions meant to make affection appear transactional. Leo was called by the plaintiffs to describe his hours. He answered in a way that was direct and earnest, and when pressed about timesheets, he produced them. There was a tension where small kindnesses were parsed under the microscope of policy. The clerk announced a short recess, and in the hot smell of courthouse hallway, they ate vending machine sandwiches and tried to hold on to the sense that they were still whole. A pivotal moment came when Sophia's drawing was entered into evidence. There was a hush as the paper unfolded in the courtroom. The crayon sun slanted with a child's confidence. 2 stick figures, one labeled Dad and one labeled Friend, with a heart in between. The image opened a space in which narrative shifted from suspicion to empathy. A long cross-examination followed, where a witness offered to explain the schedule of charity events and to demonstrate the boundaries that make professions safe. Nora answered questions in 8 to 10 long turns that combined confession and policy discussion. She said, I have spent my life making rules to keep companies solvent, and sometimes, in doing that, I have forgotten how to make room for people to be unaccountable for beauty." Marcus, the corporate counsel, objected sparingly, but his lines of questioning eventually gave way to something quieter when community members came forward. Priya Shah produced records that showed Hugo Vega, a mid-level manager, had used a similar accommodation years earlier with no effect on fairness, and that the company had benefited from the goodwill. There was testimony from a union rep named Elena Martinez who spoke about the dignity of labor. The hearing turned into an examination of precedent where witnesses named small acts that had ripple effects. Each testimony lasted in long sequences that built tension and then released it like breathing. After the hearing, the board did not immediately rule. In private meetings, Robert Ames argued for distance, citing the risk to reputation. Others argued for reform. Nora sat across from Marcus and Jenna and said she would accept a mediated review of her interactions and that she would volunteer for an internal program to bridge staff and management. She offered to fund a pilot program for literacy and after-school support that would include payment for janitorial overtime when staff attended volunteer functions, a rethinking of how corporate generosity translated into fairness. The offer surprised the board with its practical humility. Leo watched the negotiations as if he were a guest at a play where he could not predict the ending. There was a moment where Nora took out her checkbook, which she had not done in years without a meeting, and wrote a figure meant to be helpful and small and immediately public in its generosity. The gesture reframed the discussion from punishment to repair. The board suggested policy updates and a transparency clause that required disclosure for any non-trivial interactions between executives and staff. This felt like a victory that also left room for critique. The personal consequences were immediate for both of them. Leo received a transfer notice in an email that suggested his role be moved to a different facility during the company review period. He felt like someone who had been asked to step out of place for the comfort of others. Nora, facing the quiet humiliation of a performance review that asked about judgment, chose to step back from a committee she had chaired for years. In a private conversation of elongated turns, they sat on a park bench and talked about what sacrifice meant. Nora said she was tired of bending herself into a shape that pleased everyone except the person she might have been to someone else. Leo said he feared the world that called kindness reckless. Sophia drew pictures of them on a paper placemat and said to them both, "You are my team," and that phrase struck them with an ache. The community response evolved into a coalition. Maria Gutierrez, who ran a neighborhood outreach program, wrote an op-ed about the need for corporate policies to account for the humanity of workers. Daniel, the journalist, published a long feature that balanced the power between two people who had been reduced to caricatures. The story invited readers to consider whether rules protect or stifle the small acts that stitch a city together. Local activists like Rosa and Tony organized a panel where representatives from HR, unions, and volunteers came to speak. The conversation shifted into policy and then into practical programs. Nora used her influence to create a scholarship for employees pursuing higher education, and Leo found that his transfer came with an invitation to lead a community maintenance team with a modest raise and a guarantee of stability. The legal files were closed without punitive sanctions, but with a set of new protocols and a binding agreement to fund community programs. It felt like a compromise. It felt also like a beginning. They made choices that changed their lives every day. Nora began to spend an hour a week volunteering where Leo worked, and sometimes they ran literacy sessions together. Their dialogue in those sessions was patient and extended, with 8 to 10 exchanges a night, where they coached children through simple sentence structure and read books aloud in voices that alternated between serious and silly. They learned how to argue about cereal brands in the lightest way, and how to apologize without counting a cost. The sensory details of these small domestic scenes grew into rituals: the smell of warm glue during art nights, the scratch of markers on cardboard, the way Sophia's hair smelled after a day at the park. Nora felt what had been missing in the ledger of her life, as if a new column had opened. Leo felt an easing of the constant calculation that had kept him awake in winter. They practiced kindness as if it were a skill you sharpened by doing it. About a third of the way through this story, the community was asked to weigh in, and the audience was invited to participate. If you have ever seen someone judged for opening their life to someone from another place in society, write yes or no and tell us one line about what you learned. Your answers create a conversation that matters. The comment box became a place where strangers offered stories of small acts that changed them, and of family members who bridged gaps with cups of soup or with legal counsel. The thread became a point of mapping empathy rather than accusation. That engagement had the practical effect of keeping the story alive beyond headlines, and of reminding the cast that their choices resonated in ways that were not always measured by courts. The climax of the institutional test arrived in a formal hearing before a company oversight committee convened in a wood-paneled room. The meeting read like a tribunal in miniature. Counsel explained the recommended changes to policy and asked Nora to accept a compliance plan that included disclosure clauses and mandatory sensitivity training for executives. She listened and, in a string of long, careful exchanges, explained why those measures were necessary but not sufficient. She asked for accountability for the board when they had outsourced decisions that affected workers. The argument stretched out in speech after speech, and finally, the board voted to adopt a package of reforms that included a funded employee education program, a hotline for concerns about favoritism, and a restorative justice process to mend harm done to individuals. The vote was not unanimous, but it passed. In the public record, Marcus called it a good faith resolution, and Jenna called it a step toward an improved culture. Leo sat there, fingers folded, and felt the strange mix of vindication and exposure. After the votes and the paperwork, they returned to the quiet work of building a life. Nora accepted an offer from an NGO to advise on corporate and community partnerships 1 day a week, a position that made space for purpose rather than pure profit. She had a reduction in salary but gained a title that read Director of Community Initiatives, which she wore like a small flag. Leo received the formal assurance that his hours would be protected and a promotion to lead facilities that came with a small housing stipend that relieved months of anxiety. They navigated practical changes with conversations in which they explained to colleagues why they insisted on certain terms and how they would care for Sophia's needs. Their friends were many and varied. Names like Maria Gutierrez, Carmen Martin, Tony Alvarez, Elena Martinez, Daniel Klein, Malik Johnson, and Priya Shah recurred in their lives as people who shared concrete help. They attended meetings where small reforms were debated and then implemented. Accountability was both humiliation and relief. They had to rebuild some trust with those who felt betrayed by their initial secrecy and to accept that power must be monitored by those who lack it. There were moments of private tension that could have undone them. Nora worried that the trust she offered might be interpreted as charity and that Leo might resent being seen as a cause. He worried that her world would always be able to absorb scandal in ways his could not. In a long and intimate exchange late at night, they spoke of boundaries and of the ways people obscure their vulnerabilities. Nora asked whether he felt like their relationship made him a spectacle. He answered in a slow series of turns that he did sometimes feel exposed, but that he liked how she listened. They spoke of humility and of not needing to protect each other from the truth in their different pasts. Sometimes their conversations were quiet rituals of confessions and practical plans, where they broke down household budgets or argued gently about doctor appointments or Sophia's math homework. The epilogue begins with 1 month later, where small, measurable changes were visible. 1 month later, Nora had inaugurated the pilot literacy program in a modest ceremony where children sat on a checkered blanket and volunteers handed out crayons. The program reported that 25 employees had signed up for tuition assistance and that attendance at volunteer nights had tripled. Maria Gutierrez published a short report showing how corporate funds used with community input created measurable improvements in after-school attendance and reduced absenteeism among building staff. Leo's transfer was adjusted so he kept his seniority and he received a small raise that covered 2 months of overdue utility bills. Sophia began a weekly art club and proudly announced she would show her drawing to class. Marcus Reed circulated a memo about transparency protocols, and Jenna Park held a roundtable where employees could air concerns without fear. The small gestures translated into numbers that could be cited and that mattered to people who needed proof that promises would not evaporate. 3 months later, the pilot had become a program. The company established a formal partnership with the local nonprofit led by Maria. and expanded the educational fund to $500 per employee per semester. Alina Martinez and the union negotiated a clause that guaranteed paid time for community work, which allowed staff like Leo to participate without being penalized. The program recorded a 32% increase in staff-reported job satisfaction in an internal survey. Nora had given up her spot on a prestige committee and took a sustained position advising on program design, which allowed her to step out of the old cycles of praise and into a more direct role. Leo led a team that redesigned the night shift to include training modules and mental health check-ins and noted that fewer maintenance calls were missed. Sophia joined a Saturday reading club where Daniel, the journalist, volunteered once to read aloud, and she beamed because the man who had written about her family came bearing a silly hat. Community members like Rosa and Tony reported that neighborhood kids were spending more time in safe spaces and less time wandering freestanding in the evenings. The numbers began to feel less like abstractions and more like the evidence of lives made steadier. 6 months later, the changes were tangible and still imperfect but durable. The pilot had become a permanent program with a budget line on the corporate ledger and an annual report that included stories from employees who had returned to school. Nora had stepped down from a high-pressure role and accepted a position that let her split time between program work and mentoring entrepreneurs from low-income neighborhoods. A committee she formed included Priya Shah and Malik Johnson and had as a mission to audit the fairness of corporate volunteer policies. Leo signed a lease on a small apartment that allowed more space for Sophia, and their weekends included family breakfasts where pancakes and laughter filled the kitchen. The company reported a measurable increase in employee retention in maintenance and custodial staff, which executives attributed to the program. There were new policies about disclosure and meetings that required transparency forms, but also new practices that honored informal supports, like carpools and community dinners. They had a small wedding, with Sophia holding the rings, a ceremony that did not make headlines, but that made sense to everyone present. They kept arguing in the way people who love one another do, and they had therapies and checkups and a modest account of savings that felt like a soft net. The epilogue of 6 months showed numbers and names and projects that had become part of a story of repair rather than mere apology. The final image was of a wall in the community center where Sophia hung her drawing, of a house and 2 stick figures and a bright sun, and Nora traced the crayon lines, and Leo placed a hand on her shoulder like a seamstress at the end of a long repair. The end, they learned that courage was not absence of fear, but the choice to be vulnerable in public when doing so could serve more than one life. The tangible consequences mattered. The program, funded by Nora and supported by employees, created a new source of tuition assistance and a policy that guaranteed paid volunteer time, which became a prototype other companies asked about. The board instituted a transparency rule, which was not the final answer, but a tool that allowed employees to see where decisions were made. The legal files closed and the human files opened into programs that had names and budgets and midterm reports. They learned that small acts of kindness have a price when the world sees them as privileges rather than mutual goods. But they also learned that policy can be rewritten by people who choose accountability and care. If this story moved you, please share a memory of when someone crossed a class line to help you or someone you love. Comment with one word and a short line about what changed. Your stories help keep these conversations alive. If you liked this episode, consider subscribing for more narratives about ordinary people making difficult choices. This community values empathy and the hard work of building fair institutions. They closed with a line that Nora kept on a small card on her desk. It read, "Love is not a disruption to be managed, but a responsibility to be understood." The final scene was simple. A child named Sophia ran across a park waving a crayon drawing. Nora walked beside Leo, who carried a toolkit and a bag of groceries. They argued about whose turn it was to do bedtime and laughed over a small misadventure involving a cake that collapsed. The city around them remained complicated, bureaucratic, and sometimes cruel. Yet in a modest apartment, and in a boardroom, and in a community center, there were new practices, small reforms, and a ledger that included empathy. They had not solved inequality, but they had made a place where kindness was counted and where accountability was shared. The love between them had changed the way decisions were made and the way policies were written, and that change was the kind of victory that did not always make headlines, but made lives steadier.